Hey, this is Jamie with Stonemaier Games, and for today's video, I'm going to talk about games that have really interesting decisions to make before the first turn of the game. I have a top 10 list here. I'm going to talk a little bit about it from a design perspective, probably as I go. And I want to say that part of this list was inspired by the Dice Towers list, a similar list that I'll link in the description below. So first, some honorable mentions, some games that I won't talk about in detail, but were considered for this list were Catan, of course. I played a lot of Settlers of Catan back when it was called Settlers of Catan, and that juicy decision about placement at the beginning of the game was a great, fun decision to make. Risk also, back when I played Risk years and years ago, I loved thinking about where I would place my troops before the game began. Clans of Caledonia is a wonderful game that I love, but unlike one other game that I'll mention on this list, I think the initial placement for clans doesn't maybe have quite as big of an impact as this other game that I'll mention. And similar with Tzolk'in. I love Tzolk'in, but and at the beginning of the game you choose from 4 resource tiles. You choose 2 of them, and you get some resources. You typically advance on some tracks. That's a nice decision point, but it doesn't have a huge impact on the game. It's also a ticket to ride in terms of the starting objectives that you have in hand. And Downforce. I love Downforce. There was a decision at the beginning of the game in terms of how much you bid to get which car and which ability. But again, it didn't seem like it has an impact on the game, but it can be a relatively small impact. All right, I asked Stonemaier ambassadors what games they would put on this list, and a few that they mentioned that didn't end up making it onto my top 10 for various reasons. Maybe I haven't played them as much. Actually, I played all these games, though. Are Aeon's End, Chain Magnate, Gugong, Marvel Champions, Res Arcana, Teotihuacan, and Terraforming Mars. Yeah. There's another game with a TM acronym that I will mention in a minute. So let's jump right into the top 10 list, starting with the other TM, Terra Mystica. Terra Mystica was the one that was similar to Clans of Caledonia, and actually similar to Catan a little bit, in terms of, I was kind of weighing like how big of an impact do you have in terms of your choice at the beginning of Terra Mystica. But there are a few choices that you make. One is you get a player mat, and you are choosing which faction, which side of that mat you'll choose as your faction. So that is a pretty important decision. And then you'll also choose your starting placement for your settlements on the board. And that is a very similar choice to Catan and Clans of Caledonia, but I feel like in Terra Mystica it actually has a pretty big impact on the game. You still have a variety of choices after that have a much bigger impact on how you succeed in Terraforming Mars, or Terra Mystica, not Terraforming Mars, Terra Mystica. But I think it does have a pretty big impact, and so I wanted to put it on this list at number 10. So that's Terra Mystica at number 10. At number 9 is The Crew. The Crew is a cooperative trick-taking game where the first choice that you make each round, or each game of The Crew, because they're kind of playing a series of quick little games, little missions. The first choice you have is you're typically picking task cards off the table, and those tasks indicate cards usually that you are trying to win. So if on the table I put task cards, I put the blue 9, the pink 5, and the yellow 3. In a mission, it might say, okay, each player has to take one of those cards, and they have to earn that task. They have to win a hand with that card in it during the game. That becomes a pretty big decision, right? Because it kind of depends. Like if I have the blue 9 in my hand, I might choose the blue 9 because I'm pretty confident I can win a hand with a high blue card in my hand. But I'm also gauging. I'm looking at my yellow cards. I'm looking at my pink cards and thinking about what my fellow players might have in their hands. So that decision in The Crew has a pretty big impact on how the round plays out. Probably a huge impact. So that is The Crew in terms of task selection in a cooperative game. At number 8 is Agricola. We played after we played Catan a lot in my 20s, we moved on to Agricola and played a lot of Agricola. And in Agricola, one of the key choices you have early on in the game is which it's 2 things that you're drafting. You're drafting 2 types of cards. One are like worker cards, people cards, and one is something that I'm completely blanking on right now, but you can say it in the comments. It's 2 different types of cards that you're drafting, and they are cards that you have but aren't actually playing yet. They're just cards that you have as an option to play during the game if you are able to gain the resources or have the resources that will let you play those cards. And this is a pretty big decision. And one thing I like in Agricola is that you can completely ignore those cards. You can draft them without really knowing what you're doing, and you can end up just ignoring them and still have fun playing the core of the game. But if you want that next level experience of Agricola, you can really pay attention to those cards and get them into play and build a powerful engine during the game. And a lot of that comes down to the choices you make during the draft itself. Which of those cards do you keep, and which do you pass on to another player? So that is a big part of initial decisions you make before you make before you take any turns in Agricola. So that is kind of a drafting, kind of presetting your goals, similar to Ticket to Ride. Not exactly goals, but things to pursue that you might play during the game. Number 7 on this list is Captain Sonar. Captain Sonar is another cooperative game on this list where you play in teams in real time to essentially find and eliminate the opponent's sub. So you have this giant screen between you and the other team, and each member on your team has a different role. There are these little asymmetrical mini games that you're playing. One is about like powering up different abilities, different powers that you can use to find and remove the opponent's sub. The captain is kind of choosing where you go. There's a navigator that's listening to the opponents and figuring out where they might be, things like that. And so assigning these roles at the beginning of the game is a huge decision because you're kind of playing to people's strengths. Maybe some players are learning new roles that they haven't played before, or they're playing roles that they're very comfortable with. And so in Captain Sonar, it's a huge decision, interesting decision to make before you even play the game to determine who is going to have each role on each team. So that's Captain Sonar, number 7, kind of role selection there. And number 6 is Seasons, a game that I've rediscovered on Board Game Arena. There's a fantastic implementation on Board Game Arena. And in Seasons, there's a huge choice you make at the beginning of the game, whether or not you do a draft. You can do a draft where you draft these cards, or you can just draw 9 random cards. And the decision point either way is that you're going to set aside 3 cards to gain into your hand at the beginning of round 1, 3 more cards to gain into your hand at the beginning of round 2, and 3 more cards to gain at the beginning of round 3 into your hand. And so this is a really, really interesting choice here because you're kind of planning out not your entire game, because there are other ways to get cards during the game, but a significant part of the game. You're kind of saying, okay, I don't need these cards right away. This card only gives me points and only gives me points once. So I don't really need that for my engine building. I can set that aside and have it later in the game rather than now. While there are other cards that would be great to have right away. They give you a jump of resources, or they give you something engine building that you want to have ongoing over the course of the game. So you might want to have them right away at the beginning of the first round. And one of the things I love about this, even though it's a big decision, especially for someone who doesn't know Seasons, is that you get to, because you've planned this out, you kind of have something to look forward to, and that it feels free once you get it. Once you get to round 2, maybe your hand size has dwindled. You hardly have any cards in hand, and all of a sudden you get these 3 cards that you planned ahead, that you planted for yourself in the future, and that feels really good in Seasons. That's why that's my number 6. My number 5 is Hearts, the classic card game Hearts. So in Hearts, it also includes a bit of a draft in that, but it's a mini draft in that in Hearts, you're going to choose 3 cards from your hand and you're going to pass them to the player on your left. And you're also going to receive 3 cards from the player on your right. And so the heart of this decision, right, is which 3 cards am I going to remove from my hand? Because in Hearts, you're typically trying to get more hearts in your hand, so you can or you're trying to typically get rid of hearts. You don't want to win the hearts, but you're trying to structure your hand around that concept of not having the hearts, and potentially even shooting the moon and taking all the hearts. So you might structure your hand based on that. And so as you pass these cards around, as you do the single pass, you choose 3 cards and pass them, you are setting yourself up for a big part of the game. Like, what strategy are you going to pursue? Are you going to try to not take hearts? Are you going to try to shoot the moon? And you don't know what you're going to get from the player on your right. So you're also trying to think about a little bit, what could they pass me that will really hurt or help my strategy? And also, there's information in the passing itself. As you receive information from the other player, you kind of might see, oh, they didn't pass me any hearts. Does that mean they're going to try to shoot the moon? And you have that information, but no other players have that information. So I really like this decision point of which cards to pass, and trying to figure out your strategy based on the cards that you received and what you know about the player on your right in Hearts. That's my number 5. My number 4 is Magic the Gathering. And I can understand there might be some debate about whether or not this should exactly be on this list because it's a specific format for Magic. Actually, for various formats for Magic, you are constructing a deck. You're pre-constructing a deck before you play. And you're either doing that in like the standard format of Magic, you are pre-constructing a deck from cards that you own and playing with those cards. The format I really love is drafting. I've mentioned drafting actually several times on this list. But I love in Magic where you're drafting cards, and so you're selecting all these cards, making a ton of choices during the draft, and then even after you do the draft, before you start playing, you then have to construct a deck from the cards that you've drafted. And then you start actually taking turns. Then you actually play with that deck. So in Magic, a huge part of the game happens before you even take a single turn, especially in a draft. And I love that. I love all those decisions that happen during the draft. Now, one of the downsides to this, though, and this is kind of the big topic I wanted to mention here, is that this is a huge barrier to entry for someone who is either playing Magic for the first time or playing any game that has decisions before the first turn, or for someone who hasn't played the game in a long time. They will feel like they are at a severe disadvantage because you were telling them, before you understand this game, before you're actually going to take a turn, you have to understand all these things to make this crucial decision. So that is a huge downside to having interesting decisions before the first turn, and that's the reason that I don't really do that in Stonemaier games. In our games, at most, there's a very, very small decision to make before you start to play, because the way I like to teach, the way I like to learn games is to actually start to take turns. And so I don't like having a big decision in there. Now, one thing that you can do, I'm going off into a design discussion here for a second, but one thing I think that designers can do to mitigate this is potentially to have, like in Agricola, you can have a version of the game where you get a bunch of random cards. This is like a Seasons 2. Where you just get a random hand of cards that you can choose whether or not you want to pay attention to them, or you can do a draft, or you can do some sort of selection there. And so in that way, you can still have fun with experienced players, a mix of experienced and unexperienced players, getting that random hand of cards and them dealing with those cards. Or once everyone is experienced and everyone is familiar with the game and ready to jump into a draft, you can do a draft. So that is Magic the Gathering and a greater design discussion about decisions before the first turn of the game. At number 3 is Kemet. Kemet is a wonderful game with a lot of player interaction. It is largely a combat game, but it has a lot of strong Euro elements of progression. You're getting these tiles that level up, that give you kind of more abilities. You're also leveling up your access to those abilities throughout the game. And in Kemet, one of the decision points, actually you kind of make two decision points early in the game. One is how you are going to orient your pyramids, essentially, to determine what abilities you have access to. And I believe at Kemet, it's been a little while since I played, but I believe that you also take one of those tiles during setup. You actually gain one of the power tiles during setup itself, and you have it. But that might be dependent on where you set up your pyramids. It has been a little while since I played, but there are some key decision points that you make in Kemet before you start playing, based on which pyramids you have on the board, how you level them, and which tile you take at the beginning of the game. And so Kemet is my number 3 game on this list for that reason. We're down to the number 2 and number 1. This was very close because these games are games that I really love. Oh, and I forgot to show, I did have a Magic pack. I got this before or during the pandemic, hoping that I could actually draft during the pandemic, but that has not happened. But I'm still really excited to have a Magic Mystery Booster draft. The number 2 game on my list is my childhood copy of Stratego. Stratego is a game where a significant part of the game happens before you actually take a turn. Because in Stratego, you are setting up all of these one-sided pieces. Here, I'll show you my old school pieces. So this is what the opponent sees. This is what you see. You see a token with a number on it. You are setting these up facing away from your opponent, so you know the setup of your army on the battlefield, but your opponent doesn't know. And you're setting that up so that you can have an advantage to go find your opponent's flag and capture it, but also so that your flag is hidden and protected amongst your army. This is one of the things I love about Stratego. I love all the choices and that you get to feel kind of clever and mischievous as you set up this vast army that your opponent knows nothing about. And then you actually get to start playing. So in Stratego, there are huge, interesting decisions made before you get to start your first turn, and that's why I put it at number 2. Could have easily been number 1. But I think maybe I prefer the number 1 game just a little bit more, and that is Role Player. Role Player is a game where you are essentially building a D&D character. through a variety of different categories. There's a lot of fun dice placement mechanisms in this game too. And a huge decision you make at the beginning of the game is you grab a bunch of dice. I believe it's 6 dice. It might be even more dice. And you grab these random dice, you roll them, and then you decide where you want to position them on your player mat. And so there's all these things in Role Player based on where you might want to place those dice. You might want to place those dice based on certain colors or certain numbers. But you actually start the game with that decision point of where do you want to put all those dice at the beginning of the game. Because every time you place a die in one of the 6 categories, you activate an ability. So by placing those dice there or setting them at the beginning of the game, you're essentially saying, I will have less of a chance to activate these one-time abilities during the game because I am covering up these slots. Hopefully Joe can throw up a great image here to show you what I'm talking about. But the player mat has 3 slots per category. So if I put all 3 dice during setup on one of those categories, it means that I will never activate that ability during the game. But at the same time, by setting them up in that way, I might have the ideal score for that category set up right at the beginning of the game. It's this sense of endowed progress where I've already made a ton of progress in the game for a very specific goal or goals because of the way I've set this up. It is such a fun, juicy decision. And it's actually one of the reasons it's so high on this list is that even if you don't know how to play Role Player, right away off the bat, based on a few of your goals, you can see, oh, I want yellow dice in this slot, or I need at least 14 value of dice in this slot, even without you understanding any other element of the game. So you can make those interesting decisions during setup in Role Player without understanding fully how to play, or without remembering how to play if you haven't played in a while. So I think Role Player kind of balances that really well, where it gives you an interesting decision if you know what you're talking about in Role Player. And if you don't, if you're new to it, you still have a fun, interesting decision without you needing to understand the rest of the game to do that. So that's why Role Player is the #1 game on this list. So I've kind of already covered the discussion topic here, but I'd love to hear what you think. If you have some games that have really interesting decisions before you actually take a turn in the game, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Or if you have thoughts about games that do this, or games that balance between those two things in the way they maybe offer different modes, like I mentioned with Seasons and Agricola, drafting versus non-drafting. But for me, it all comes down to onboarding. How are you going to onboard a new player or a player who hasn't played the game for a long time into the game so they can quickly and easily get into the game without feeling like they're suddenly faced with a huge impediment to them playing the game well because you've asked them to make a crucial decision before the first turn. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that topic in the comments below. Thanks.